Welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast all about freedom and the nanny state. In this episode, we discuss the suppression of the lab leak theory, the failure of minimum pricing for alcohol, and how to take on big tech censorship. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hello, Chris.
You say that in an increasingly resigned way every episode.
I know there's a kind of more of a sigh, yeah, as I am in every single episode. But you look very sun-tanned, burned, somewhere in between.
Tis the season, isn't it? I just get out there. No suntan lotion.
And we're delighted to be joined on the show today. It's first time on the show by Robby Soave. He's a senior editor at Reason Magazine, co-host of Rising on the Hill TV, and the author most recently of Tech Panic, which is very pertinent to one of the discussions we're going to get into today. Robby, thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, nice to talk to you guys.
So Robby, let's start with you and the lab leak theory, the latest with the lab leak theory and the attempt to suppress it, really. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when it was dismissed out of hand as a racist conspiracy theory, this idea that the coronavirus pandemic might have started in a lab in Wuhan rather than a wet market. But in recent weeks and months, the evidence pointing towards that actually being the origin has just been piling up. I know this is something that you've been covering quite closely, Robby, on Reason and on your show as well, on the Hill TV. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the latest is, what the latest kind of reporting is, particularly around who journalists now believe were the first 3 people infected with the coronavirus?
For sure. And I should begin by noting, it's not like I started out invested in either or any specific explanation for where COVID comes from. But the idea that thinking it came from the lab was a conspiracy theory and racist struck me the wrong way, because if you think about it, it's almost the anti-racist version of where COVID comes from, because it's the one that also impugns, the U.S. government and sort of just the West in general for having, funded this research that was going on at the lab. And it was specific safety practices there, and then it would have been covered up by the Chinese government. That's actually a lot less racially problematic than the idea that specifically Asian culinary practices are where the disease comes from. Obviously, it should just be whatever the truth is what it is. We should just pursue the truth where it leads. But where it has led recently, yes, there has now been independent reporting and also confirmed by the Wall Street Journal that these 3 scientists, one of them a top deputy of Xi Jinping, the so-called Bat Lady, were sick with COVID-like symptoms in November 2019. And now they have denied that. Just on Friday, finally, the U.S. government released their report on what they know so far. Spoiler, they didn't tell us anything new. They did not explain where they've arrived at their various conclusions. And then there was a statement put out by one of the scientists saying that no, he wasn't sick with COVID. So it's still unresolved, to be clear. But the Chinese government's claims that, we tested them for antibodies, the scientists, everyone who worked at the lab was tested for antibodies in March of 2020, and no one had antibodies for COVID. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because by March of 2020, even if no one in the laboratory was the patient 0 or anything, someone by then, just statistically, the outbreak was in that area of China, someone would have had antibodies for the disease, even if they had just caught it elsewhere. So bottom line is it's frustrating. We can't trust what the Chinese government tells us. Frankly, we have to be a little concerned about what our own U.S. health officials and investigators say, because, again, this gives me no pleasure, but they're a little bit implicated here if indeed it came from a lab on funding, on grants that the U.S. health officials recommended and supported, and still to this day say are very important and should continue.
And just on that point, because I think that's probably something that's got a little less coverage over here, certainly, which is the kind of US government's involvement in it. And even in particular, Anthony Fauci, who was obviously heading up the kind of federal government's response to COVID-19. Could you say a little bit more about that for people, particularly on our side of the pond, who might not be as up to speed on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Anthony Fauci, in his role as head of the National Institutes of Health, was the the coronavirus czar. He was the top public government official doing the pandemic response, advising on policies and everything, famous, globally famous person. He's also the foremost advocate of doing what's called gain of function research, the manipulation of viruses that can make them more infectious and more deadly. He was this agency, a sub-agency, a NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. They do these grants. He's the head of it, and he advocates funding this kind of research. And in fact, this research was paused during the Obama years. President Obama said, you know what, this sounds like a bad idea. We're going to stop doing this. But this is the problem with government bureaucracies. They can get around what the political officials want them to do. So there were exceptions granted so the research could continue. And Dr. Fauci personally signed them. He was recently deposed. He said, oh, yeah, I granted exceptions. I don't remember exactly for what. It was a long time ago. But yeah, I did. And then the pause ended and they kept funding the research. So it's not at all crazy to think that the very person we put in charge of responding to the pandemic may have indirectly contributed to it happening in the first place by advocating and funding research that was done under unsafe lab conditions in another part of the world.
And Chris, let's bring you in here. Where are you on the lab leak theory at this point since we last discussed it?
About 99% convinced, like I more or less have been from the beginning, really. But I mean, the more I read about it, there's quite a good piece in the Sunday Times a few weeks ago. Matt Ridley's written something about it in the latest issue of the Spectator. And obviously, Matt is a proponent of this theory, and maybe I should read more widely and try and find alternative views. But everything I read about it just makes me more and more convinced that unless there was an unbelievable coincidence going on, the obvious explanation is the obvious explanation. It's just, I don't really know anyone who doesn't believe it, I don't think, because it just seems too extraordinary. If it's just a coincidence and somehow this virus traveled 1,000 miles or whatever it was and just happened to drop onto something in a wet market in the city that happens to be the main center for bat coronaviruses, So I don't need much more persuading. I am open to the alternative views on this, and perhaps I should seek them out. I think the Sunday Times said, and maybe Robby can tell me if this is right or not, it seemed a very striking piece of information, that somebody who was working in the lab came up with a vaccine for coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, in February 2020, which obviously was right at the very beginning of the pandemic. I mean, it almost hadn't spread from China at that point, which, if correct, that does seem suspiciously quick. And I guess that's the point of the gain of function research. And again, I really think people shouldn't be doing gain of function research. I'm not a scientist, Tom. Maybe there are very good reasons for it, but just making a virus much more contagious to human beings so you can then find a vaccine for it doesn't seem the best use of a scientist's time to me, and sounds like, as I think we've seen in the last few years, sounds a bit too reckless.
Is that something you've heard, Robby, about a vaccine potentially being developed in China that early on?
So my understanding is the speedy development of the vaccine is not necessarily really evidence that they had the genetic sequence immediately, but that it's easy to get that. The difficulty with the vaccines taking so long to hit store shelves, right, is all the safety stuff they have to do, satisfying regulatory concerns, which they moved at lightning speed here, but lightning speed was still however many months it took. I think the really compelling piece of evidence, in addition to, if those scientists were sick with COVID-like stuff, 3 scientists in November of 2019, and that can ever be proven, or if we find some record gets released where they say, oh yeah, they were sick with COVID, that's game over. The guy you would most expect to be the first person to get COVID, if he was the first person to have COVID, no, there's no animal origin. Obviously, if they found the crossover animal species, which they have in other epidemics, then that would indicate the animal that it was natural zoonotic spillover. The other piece of evidence that they had indicating the wet market just have not held up over time. Like they put out a report saying they found the raccoon dogs. Remember when they were falsely accused? These cute little animals, falsely accused. They said they had genetic material and COVID, and it was all in the same swabs, but that turned out to not actually be anything. That was like later debunked. So it's look, again, I'm allowing for either. I'm not invested in either explanation, but it does at this point seem like it's much more likely to be a lab leak. Also, I didn't know this until this happened, and I started looking more closely. But viruses, disease pathogens, have escaped labs all the time, and people have died because of it. There was a famous outbreak of anthrax that escaped from a Soviet laboratory. It's happened over and over and over again, and every time it happens, the government and the scientific establishment of that country covers it up. The scientific establishments of other countries, because they all have equally invested in this not being science's fault, say, yeah, nothing went wrong there. What are you talking about? And then years later, we find out, oh yeah, it was a lab leak. So that's where I'm betting at this point. If it's happened before, it could happen.
No, completely. I mean, I am struck by how, what you say there, you're not necessarily invested in either way, apart from where the evidence is obviously pointing at this point. But how invested everyone else seemed to be in it being zoonotic spillover and it being originating from the wet market or whatever. And I don't mean people who were financially implicated in the way that you've been discussing, or implicated because they were part of government departments funding this research. Like, I was really struck by that scrap 2 years ago between Jon Stewart and the vaccine scientist Peter Hotez. Jon Stewart goes on Stephen Colbert and makes this very funny joke where he says, I'm going to butcher it and people should go and listen to it, but essentially like, I wonder where the bat coronavirus outbreak began. Could it be the bat coronavirus lab in the middle of the city where it began, and so on? And this was a moment in which it got criticised by a lot of liberals. Back then it was seen as a very Republican opinion to hold. You had this vaccine scientist, Peter Hotez, who's taken on a kind of life of his own in the COVID culture war in recent months. We don't necessarily need to get into that. Chastise him for essentially attacking the science. And it did make me think that, especially where kind of experts and scientists are concerned, it's not as if, their expertise is invalid or whatever, but a lot of them do seem to have kind of educated themselves out of common sense. Like, the counterintuitive explanation is almost always the more appealing one for them. I don't really know what it is, but it's, again, when you lay it out as simply as Chris did earlier or Jon Stewart did in that joke, it's so striking that for, what was it, the best part of 18 months at least, it was verboten to speak about this, really, in certain circles.
It was literally suppressed on social media. On Facebook, they would delete all content referencing this for a long time period, and then eventually they changed that policy. So it's incredible the level of the media forces, kind of mainstream media people saying that yes, you're a racist conspiracy theorist if you think that this has any plausibility whatsoever. It's incredible. I'm not someone who thinks like every crazy idea or something turns out to be correct. Obviously, like a lot of times they don't, but this is the danger in just, shutting people down or silencing people based on the idea, that's crazy. Experts really think that's wrong. They fact check this. Here's what experts have to say. Well, like, experts are invested people too. Experts in the public health community, again, they might be on the hook for some of this, and anyway, even if they're not, they want to keep doing it without greater oversight. And no scientist doing experiments wants greater government oversight on what they're doing and what they're funding. That's just human nature. But we know that this happened. This comes from fiction. This is as old as like Dr. Frankenstein invents the monster that kills him. Right? This was part of what Jon Stewart said in that joke, that science can do extraordinary things, but like the moral dimension of whether we should and under what circumstances is not necessarily a question science can answer. Like, if this research is so important to do, can it be done in a secure facility in Antarctica or something? Does it have to be done under the purview of a notoriously non-transparent government in lab conditions that are obviously unsafe? There are reports of these people going to the caves to collect the bat samples. They're not wearing masks. They're not wearing gloves. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and it's not like the stakes here were small. 10 million, 20 million people globally died because of this. We were miserable for years. It's catastrophic what it caused. So forgive me for being a little curious. I want to know. I really would like to know. Sorry.
And the incuriosity of everyone else has always been quite striking, because it does, especially given how high the stakes were. This is surely potentially one of the biggest censorship scandals the West has had in the 21st century. Like, if you think about how important it is that we work out what happened with this particular pandemic and the swiftness with which that was shut down, it was really quite startling. But before we move on, I suppose just want to ask about how do you feel, Robbie, that the sort of picture is for big tech censorship at the moment? You mentioned there that many places suppress this story. They've since reversed their policies. Do you think lessons are being learned about why it's not a good idea to police alleged misinformation in this way? Or do you think, as I suspect is the case, that they'll just try and kind of whistle and walk away from the crime scene when this one is concerned?
I think lessons are being learned by some entities. I think perhaps by the social media companies themselves, and they're probably the most important entities for learning lessons. But the political figures, the media, establishment media kind of voices who have made misinformation, according to them, is the biggest crisis of our times, and the only answer to it is vigorous suppression of speech. They're not ever going to be persuaded that that was a bad call. But I do think, obviously Twitter is under different leadership that has pluses and minuses. Zuckerberg has talked publicly about how frustrated he is with some of the guidance he received from the government. The Twitter files themselves have reviewed not just on the COVID subject, but on a lot of law enforcement, election-related stuff, the Hunter Biden stuff. There is some recognition going on, I think, with the social media companies that just outsourcing content moderation to government, federal bureaucrats, scientists, the FBI, was a complete disaster. Because it made the social media companies look partisan and foolish and embarrassed, and I don't think they like looking embarrassed. Zuckerberg, Dorsey, a lot of the others have talked about this, the regrets they have. It's not everything; it doesn't magically fix the problem, but I maybe, if this could be totally naive, I think they might not just go along with things quite as easily next time. They've certainly learned something.
I think this lab leak example is a very good example of it, because I don't agree with social media companies censoring people at all, but you can sort of see their thinking when it comes to people spreading dangerous anti-vax myths. Genuine, there could be legitimate implications for public health. Whereas this lab leak thing, it's just people discussing how this started. And, Robbie mentions this thing about being racist, which I just don't see that at all. But it's like they were censoring people not for the protection of public health in any sense, but just because that's what public health people were saying. And we can't question public health people, no matter what they're talking about. Even in this instance, it's something that's kind of not really fully in their remit. So, I thought it was a particularly egregious example, really.
And it was, as you were sort of suggesting earlier, Robbie, fueled those conspiracy theorists as well, and those anti-vaxxers. Like, if you wanted a neat example of how censorship can often spread suspicion and vindicate people who tend to see conspiracies everywhere, it's a pretty good example. You hear it in relation to the lab leak theory, where if you get into a row of a conspiracy theorist, they were like, well, that was a conspiracy theory 2 years ago. Conspiracy theorists have a funny way of being right about things. All of these kinds of arguments, which are obviously specious, but nevertheless point to the fact that you try and censor these people, you're going to make them a lot worse and a lot more suspicious and a lot more convinced that a plot is afoot. But Chris, we're fast running out of time, and I want to make sure we give enough time to your nanny state stories that you picked out this week. Shall we start with this study, which I believe is hot off the press? I saw you sent it round just like shortly before we came on. So hopefully you've had a bit of time to read it at least. But this is about minimum unit pricing for alcohol. A new study claiming that it's had a positive impact, but not for alcoholics. Which surely that should be the people it's supposed to help. But do you want to tell us a little bit about this?
Originally, it was supposed to be those people, yeah. Well, this is hot off the press for us, recording on on Monday night. It won't be by the time people hear this, so I imagine will be in the news quite a bit. So this is not just a study, this is a final evaluation. This is the final official government evaluation of minimum pricing. So when minimum pricing was introduced in 2018, it came with a sunset clause. It had to be shown to work in its first 5 years, otherwise it gets repealed in its sixth year. So realistically, there was never much question about what the judgment would be, right? But along the way, it's been quite interesting because this evaluation has been, in my opinion, pretty good for the most part. Quite rigorous, quite impartial, quite detailed, good breadth and depth to it, looking at all sorts of different things, various different methodologies. And just time after time, it just comes up and doesn't really find anything. It doesn't really find any positive impact from minimum pricing, often finds some negative impacts. Not always conclusively, but it's been pretty slim pickings for the pro-minimum pricing crowd. With the exception of one study that came out, was published in the Lancet, which is obviously very high profile, in March. And they used essentially a sort of hypothetical counterfactual and compared what actually happened in Scotland in terms of alcohol-related deaths and hospitalizations with what they think might have happened, which was kind of based on what happened in England, but not completely. And essentially, even though by 2020, which was the last year in this particular study, alcohol-related deaths in Scotland were higher than they had been for quite a long time, they said, we think that minimum pricing reduced the number of alcohol-related deaths by 13%. Okay? And so viewers of the BBC were treated to this kind of absurd sight of reporters standing in front of this graph of alcohol-related deaths, we were just going up and up and saying, as you can see, minimum pricing has brought down the number of alcohol-related deaths. So that came out, and basically the final evaluation is just focused entirely on that study, ignored all the other ones. I think there's about 20 or 30 other studies that have been carried out under this official evaluation, but they picked the only one that seemed to find a positive impact, and they're saying, yeah, this works. But as you say, even they couldn't disguise the fact that it hasn't had an effect on the heaviest drinkers. I guess they will be saying we need to put the price up now in order to reach these hard-to-reach groups.
Is this something you've come across in the US or any US states that are experimenting with this, Robby, this attempt to kind of solve alcoholism by making it more expensive that we've been experimenting with over here?
Certainly. I mean, it is, we have it, the process of procuring alcohol varies by state to state, but there's just tremendous a kind of alcohol cartel and the distributors and how you can get it. So the prices are already outrageous. I'm more familiar with syntaxes on cigarettes and other smoking products, actually. In fact, on vaping, too. They're trying to, this very, I think, misguided war on vaping in the U.S. A lot of people vape instead of smoking cigarettes. A lot of people have quit smoking because of vaping. But they tried to ban the flavored vapes, the idea they're being targeted at children, but adults like the flavored ones perfectly well. And again, some kids smoke cigarettes. You'd rather have them vaping. It just makes no sense. Very counterproductive. But I'm worried. Our CDC, our health officials we're so empowered from the pandemic. We have a strong culture of individual freedom in the U.S. of leaving people alone to decide for themselves how best to organize their lives, and that guiding principle of our country, best thing about the U.S., took such a massive hit during COVID, and now it's people who I think never. The CDC says don't eat red meat, don't eat floss. I don't know 8,000 times a day. You can never floss enough. You can never have enough bread. Nobody necessarily said I have to do this, and I worry that has changed a bit. So it's frustrating.
And Chris, unless you got any more on minimum unit pricing and syntaxes, there was also this story that you picked out about Danone, if that's how you pronounce it, UK and Ireland, which the only thing I can remember them selling is that weird Yakult thing, looked like a kind of funky bottle of milk that they used to sell to children.
Yes, you're right. I thought it was shampoo for some reason. I thought they were associated with shampoo.
It sounds very nondescript as a company, but this has been described, at least in the Guardian piece, as a UK food giant, and it's called on the government to introduce taxes and advertising restrictions on food that is deemed high in fat, sugar and salt. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, and the Guardian were all over this, going, isn't this wonderful? Finally, we have an honest corporation telling it like this. But if you look at what Danone produce, it was mostly it's water. It's literally it's mineral water. They own Evian and Volvic, and I think they own Harrogate. Like, they own all the big brands of bottled water. And that, I think, is where most of their money comes from. Then they have things like Yakult and a few sort of yogurty things and sort of basically like health foods that I don't really recognize because I don't eat them. But they're not. But the point is, they're not going to be affected by taxes and regulation of food that is high in fat, sugar, and salt. It was just the most blatant rent seeking. And the Guardian, who you might imagine nostalgically at one time might have been against putting up the price of the working man and woman's food, they were all obviously in favour of the taxes, but also didn't comment on the fact that this was just blatant corporate rent seeking. And then I saw something a day later from a company who I'd never heard of. What were they saying? So yeah, there was an op-ed from this guy. He's a CEO of Dash Water, basically saying that artificial sweeteners kill you. The World Health Organization has accepted this, and it's time for the industry to change. He wasn't explicitly calling for more regulation to nobble his competitors. Dash Drinks, as far as I can tell, make drinks that are not artificially sweetened or sweetened with sugar. They're sort of naturally sweetened, I guess, if at all. And so, again, this is somebody else, as far as I can see, who's just trying to nobble the competition. And I don't like that. You'd think they might get called out for it a bit more often rather than just have people naively kind of applauding them for doing the right thing. I don't know what you call it, woke washing or health washing or something, but something pretty iffy is going on there. And I was surprised, really, that more people didn't think it was a little bit fishy.
And one thing that you touched upon in this critic piece is the fact that the way in which these different nanny state measures often really benefit big companies, whether it's in alcohol or whether it's whatever. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because that's one under-discussed bit of this whole debate, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the sugar tax is a good example of this. So the original premise of the sugar tax was that people would consume fewer sugary drinks. And I think the implication was that people would probably consume fewer fizzy drinks overall. That's not what happened. They actually, the soft drink company sold more fizzy drinks. They sold fewer sugary drinks, partly because they took sugar out of some of their drinks. But the overall market for soft drinks rose. Now, partly that's because the year it came in was a particularly hot summer, but I believe it's continued to be pretty good for sales ever since. And artificially sweeteners are a lot cheaper than sugar. So these guys were very happy, really, to take the sugar out. This probably explains why Ribena and Iron Brew and all these companies kind of went, okay, government, if you want us to, let's be good, corporate players. But the reality is, so long as you can maintain your sales, which Iron Brew didn't actually do, but if you can maintain your sales, which is easier in areas like, lemonades and stuff like that, people don't really notice so much, then you can make a lot of money. And artificial sweeteners, apart from being cheaper, are much easier to source, and you don't have to buy them from fairly unstable countries in Central and South America. So it's a win-win, really, for these guys if you can persuade people to start drinking artificial sweeteners. And there are plenty of other examples of this. I mean, the booze industry is doing great, as far as I can see, out of the kind of low and no alcohol market at the moment, particularly the low alcohol market. I don't know what the profit margins are, but you look at the gin, and it's nearly as expensive as actual gin, and it hasn't got any tax on it. You kind of assume them probably doing quite well out of it. Although the public health people are against these drinks now for reasons I still can't quite understand. Probably because it means big alcohol make more money. I don't know. But yeah, look, there's lots of examples of rent seeking going on. Business, apart from anything else, businesses like it when you raise barriers to entry. They don't like it at the time, but they very quickly get used to it. And you don't often hear these industries, no matter how much they kicked off about whatever regulation it was in the first place, very rarely do you see kind of make any attempt to remove them because you've already paid for compliance. Just quickly, the ban on promoting so-called junk food in certain parts of supermarkets. One of the supermarkets, which I won't name, I'm tempted to. Apparently, when Liz Truss came in and said, we're not going to do this, they lobbied to do it because they'd already spent a lot of money preparing. There were people who were employed full-time. Some of the supermarkets, they spent several £1 million preparing for this new era in which basically people would walk around the supermarket a bit more and potentially, as a result of that, pick more stuff up, right? Because they don't see the treats straight away when they get to the entrance. So they have to go look for it. And then they find the sin aisle, and they find lots of other things on the sin aisle. So really good. So yeah, again, you got this kind of combination of public health incompetence. They don't see the unintended consequences. Businesses are less stupid, so they see the unintended consequences and they rather like them. And in that instance, actively lobbied the government to introduce something it only a year earlier lobbied against. There we
go. And Robbie, unless you've got anything to add to that, I've got a question in our next postbag section, which I think is perfect for you. So this is the bit of the podcast where we answer your questions from Twitter or from email. It's even got its own jingle, which we'll play now.
Postbag. It's bulging,
Let's reach into the postbag. As I said, there's one here with Robbie's name on it. This is from Paul Butterworth. Hello, Paul. Evening, he says, how do we stop big tech censorship? I get it's often at the behest of government, so UK government laws to prevent censorship would be a start. But if EU/US/China, etc., require censorship, posts would be removed anyway. Robbie's really kind of getting at the nub of how complicated trying to push back against this is, certainly on any kind of legislative level. What, when you're asked that question, do you say, not least to someone who I imagine is quite wary of regulating big tech in this kind of way?
Sure. Sure. We need to, I mean, with that person asking that question is getting at the heart of it. We need to regulate on the government end, not on the company end. People, I've been guilty of it myself, are frustrated with moderation decisions. We lash out at the last link in the chain, the company itself. I'm so mad Facebook did this. I'm so mad. I host a YouTube show. I'm furious with YouTube all the time. Believe me, it's so often bad. But then what the Twitter files did, what I did when I looked pretty closely at Facebook and other things, is show that there was internal opposition to the censorship at the companies many, many times. Twitter was frequently asked to take content down by the FBI. And like the first 1,000 times, they say, "What are you talking about? No, this is legitimate speech. We're not doing anything about it." But then eventually the pressure from government and the mainstream media became so all-consuming that they caved. So I would, in the U.S. at least, I would support a law saying that it is not a criminal thing, but not you lose your job if you're an FBI official doing like routine outreach to Facebook or Twitter or something asking for censorship. We can prevent the government officials from reaching out. We can't ultimately. You can't prevent in the U.S. You can't. Maybe I suppose you could in Europe, but I would be so reluctant to give them this power because the people in charge under the European Union purview, right? They want more censorship of misinformation. So you're never gonna if you give them more power, they'll never. I don't think these people are ever going to pursue using their tools in a free speech affirming way, right? So we need to move in the direction of paradoxically having less accountability for the platform. The platforms need to be less having to do what regulators want them to do. They need to be less constrained. And also we just need less regulation in general so there can be alternative competing platforms, right? Even along this time period where we're rightfully fearful of online censorship, we do have to recognize that discourse is easier than ever before because there are so many platforms, so many alternative media organizations that have flourished in the era of the internet. The conversation is less constrained than ever before, and that's due to the internet being kind of lightly regulated, all things considered, compared to other industries. And we should aspire to keep it that way so the conversation can keep going.
I've got to say, I'm probably slightly less squeamish about the prospect of regulating these companies, but completely understand your point and always makes me reassess when I think about who the people who might be legislating for this would be. They're not going to be the people who are telling these companies not to censor. They'll be telling people to censor. And as you say, we've had that in the EU. We've had obviously having that in the UK as well with this horrendously named online safety bill, which is still trundling its way through Parliament, is going to have all kinds of dreadful consequences. But Chris, have you got any thoughts on this question of big tech censorship and the best way to push back against it?
Nothing I haven't said before, Tom.
Right. So we've got a question here from Odd Kid on Twitter. I'm sure that's his real name. How about discussing the fact that your paid shills who back a poison, quote, vaccine as, quote, safe and effective, spiked online is just a clown show these days, clown emoji. I should probably respond to this myself, but Chris, I know you've been already interacting with Odd Kid on Twitter, I believe. So is there anything you want to say on this?
Yeah, I encourage him to listen to the show and we would respond to his excellent question. Odd Kid sounds like a bit of a truth seeker and a free thinker to me. And I know we've had quite a few people ask this question, haven't we, in recent months. After Fraser wrote that article saying that Andrew Bridgen was making a few elementary errors in his scientific analysis of the vaccines. And this hasn't gone down well with everyone on Twitter, has it? For whatever reason. Andrew Bridgen's got a lot of fans out there. And so now Spikes are sponsored by Pfizer and Glaxo and God knows who else. And that, of course, is the reason that Fraser wrote this piece. In amongst all the many, many anti-lockdown pieces and skeptical pieces that Spike has been producing over the last few years, this was one that Pfizer paid the big bucks for. And it's really angered a lot of people. So I'm sorry about this, Tom, if your revenue has collapsed as a result of that, but hopefully Pfizer can make up for it.
That was the thing. I wish we were paid shills of Pfizer. If nothing else, then we could, have a slightly more salubrious surrounds here. The one thing is that I think these people, as much as they make a lot of noise on social media, they wildly overestimate their numbers. I mean, they were literally saying that this is Spike's Bud Light moment, and we're going to shut you down, and so on. And whilst you'll lose some people, you lose a few Twitter followers, you make them back in a few days. It's not that big of a problem. But it is fascinating. It did sort of demonstrate that, as you say, not least given our reputation for being very skeptical, for being very principled on all of those questions around lockdown, civil liberties, compulsion, and so on. Just because of the fact that we don't agree with their favourite quack of the moment, suddenly we're paid shills and so on. The one thing I will say is that it was very entertaining.
You didn't find it tiresome at all, Tom?
No, I've had a few instances where we've really rattled a certain corner of the internet. Now, often it's people might be on the kind of woke side or the identitarian side or whatever. It's generally speaking, who you get so upset. But it's fun when you go through a period of a couple of days where, as an individual or as a magazine, anything you say will just make them spin out of control. So that's always quite entertaining, I think, most of the time. But
particularly since their whole issue with bridging was all about free speech, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They're very, very pro free speech, except for one article on Spike.
Well, that was the argument that gets thrown back at us, which really amused me, which was to say, Spike claims they're in favour of freedom of speech, but they disagree with someone I like. Hypocrisy. Like, what does that mean?
The shameless hypocrisy.
Have you had any run-ins with people like this, Robbie, or is this something which has evaded you thus far?
Oh, of course. Of course. It's every now and then you make your viewers or your readers or whoever it is upset because they've fallen with some idea you don't agree with, or they like some figure you don't like. I mean, this happens to those of us who express a lot of skepticism and a lot of contrarianism. I don't think every contrarian view is correct. I don't think the vaccines are particularly dangerous or harmful. Again, I do think it came from a lab. I think all the mandates are bad. I don't want lockdowns. I would rather jump off a building than put a mask on my face again. So there's lots of room for contrarianism. But you know what? If you just agree with every contrarian position, I don't think that demonstrates really that you're an independent thinker. In a way, that is the opposite of being an independent thinker. You're following a crowd. It's just not the mainstream or the establishment crowd. So make even the people who generally like you mad every now and then. It's a good policy, I think.
Exactly. Robbie, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.